Today we're talking about solving quadratic equations by factoring. So just for a minute, I'd like you to think about some multiplication. When you multiply two numbers together, what would it take for you to get a product of 0? What I mean by that, just for example, what number would I have to multiply by 5 to get an answer of 0? Or I could say 5 times what number equals 0? That number would have to be 0 itself. Is it fair to say then that if a product is 0, one of the numbers being multiplied together must be 0? So if x times y equals 0, doesn't either x or y need to be 0? Of course. So the same thing applies to any type of product, any type of multiplication, even with the factors we've been doing. So we're going to apply this multiplication concept to help us solve a quadratic equation. First, you need to know what a quadratic equation is. A quadratic equation is a quadratic expression set equal to 0. For example, I have the quadratic expression x squared plus 5x plus 6, and I've set it equal to 0. Now it's a quadratic equation, and I can solve for x. One way to solve for x in this case is by factoring, and that's what we're going to do today. So first thing I'm going to do is factor the quadratic side. Since we have talked a lot in class about factoring, I'm not going to go over how to factor, just what we're supposed to do after it's already factored. So when I factor x squared plus 5x plus 6, I get x plus 3 times x plus 2. Since that's equal to 0, one thing I want you to keep in mind is that these factors are being multiplied together. Two parentheses side by side means multiplication. So if this whole thing is equal to 0, then doesn't it follow that one of the two factors must equal 0? Just like the multiplication we talked about a second ago. The way I'm going to make that happen is I'm going to split these factors up, set each factor equal to 0 separately, and solve both equations. So either x plus 3 needs to be equal to 0, or the x plus 2 needs to be equal to 0. I'm going to solve them separately. On the x plus 3 equals 0, if I subtract 3 from both sides, I get x equals negative 3. Right? Negative 3 plus 3 equals 0, so x would have to be negative 3. On the right-hand side, if I subtract 2 from both sides, I get x equals negative 2. Negative 2 plus 2 equals 0, so x can be negative 2. Both of these numbers are my solution. It can be one or it can be the other, so I'm going to write them both. Both numbers work to make our original equation true. Let's go through another example. So remember, when you're factoring, you need to look first of all for a difference of squares, which this is not. Then you need to look for a common factor. These do have an x in common, so I'm going to pull out the x. To factor the quadratic side, when I factor out an x, I'm left with an x plus 3 inside the parentheses. I have two separate factors here, an x and an x plus 3. So I'm going to set each factor to 0 and solve. On the left equation, there's nothing to solve for. X is already equal to 0. On the right-hand equation, when I subtract 3 from both sides, I get x equals negative 3. So there are my two solutions. I'm going to write them both as my answer. Notice I wrote them in braces to show that this is a set of answers. This is not a point, and these are not parentheses. They're the squiggly brackets called braces. One more. what's different about this quadratic equation than the others? Well, first of all, it's not equal to 0. Remember, a quadratic equation, before I can solve it, has to be equal to 0. So if I subtracted 14 from both sides, I could force this to be equal to 0, and that's exactly what I want to have happen. Then I'm going to factor. When I factor, this time I'm going to get 3 different factors. I'm going to have a 2, an x minus 7, and a 2x plus 1. So this time, I'm going to have 3 different factors to solve. First factor of 2, there's no variable here. 2 can't ever equal 0, so I don't really get an answer from this factor. There has to be a variable involved for me to get a solution. In the middle factor, when I add 7 to both sides, I get x equals 7, which makes sense since 7 minus 7 is equal to 0. In the third factor, first thing I'm going to do is subtract 1 from both sides. Then I'm going to divide both sides by 2. And I'm going to end up with x equals negative 1/2. So even though I had 3 factors to begin with, only 2 factors had variables in them, so I'm only going to have 2 solutions. 7 and negative 1/2 works to make this equation true. So in summary, make sure the equation is equal to 0 to start with. It has to equal 0 before we can factor. Then factor the quadratic side. Set each factor equal to 0 and solve. Then write your answers in a set of braces. Write down any questions that you have so you can bring them to class. Don't forget to take your quiz on Canvas and bring your notebook to class with you. Have a great day, and I'll see you next time.